Chair Martin, yes, we can hear you. Good evening.
I want to wish everybody Happy New Year. Welcome to 2022. Hopefully it's a good year. I'm going to begin the Planning Commission meeting for February 2nd, 2022. Good evening. Welcome to tonight's meeting of the City of Tucson Planning Commission. My name is Chuck Martin. I am the chair of the Planning Commission. The responsibilities of this body are to advise the Mayor and Council and the Planning and Development Services Department on the adoption of long-range plans, policies, specific plans, and regulations that affect land use. Item number 1 is roll call. Could staff please call roll?
Yes, thank you, Chair Martin. Yes, Chair Martin.
Here.
Commissioner Gast.
Here.
Commissioner Cassidy. Absent. Commissioner McBride Olson. Absent. Commissioner Pafford.
Here.
Commissioner Young.
Here.
Commissioner Saylor Brown.
Here.
Commissioner Willett. Commissioner Ortiz-Pino.
Here.
Commissioner Lucia.
Here.
Commissioner Schwartz.
Here.
And it appears Commissioner Cassidy has joined us. So Commissioner Cassidy.
Here.
Excellent. We have a quorum.
Thank you, Daniel. Item number 2 is the election of the chair and the vice chair of the commission. I was wondering if staff could refresh my memory on regarding the process. Is there anything you can help me out with? I think normally we try to remember, ask if there's anybody that would like to be chair, or if there anybody that would like to nominate somebody for chair. So I've done my time. I can't serve any longer. So I guess, is there any commissioners that would like to be nominated for the chair of the commission? Hearing none, are there any commissioners that would like to nominate somebody for commission, the chair of the commission? Well, who's not here?
Chair Martin, I would be happy to step up and nominate myself for a position there to fill if anybody else is so inclined to fill the chair position. That would be appropriate in my opinion. But hearing nobody nominating themselves, I'd be happy to recommend myself and throw my name in the hat for the chair position and or vice chair, depending on whether or not the rest of my fellow commissioners would prefer to step up.
That'd be fine, and I'd be willing to be vice chair if that's possible. If that to help confer, to help the chair with meetings. So I guess if there's all those in favor of those nominees, say aye.
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 Aye. Those opposed, say nay. Hearing so, I think it passed unanimously, but do we need to do a roll call, Daniel, or?
I don't believe so. I seem to have passed unanimously. Thank you.
So, Lexi, it's your meeting now. I don't know if Dan is going to send a script or not, or have.
Commissioner Willett, we are happy to help you through this. And then we do have a script that we can provide for you in the future to kind of help you through some of the procedural elements. But yeah, we're happy to help kind of guide you through the process.
Yeah, that would be awesome, because I have no idea here.
Yes, and congratulations.
Thank you for the encouragement there as well, Dan, for sure.
course.
Alrighty, so I guess that's moving on to item number 3 then?
Yep.
Which is an approval of minutes and the legal action report. So do any commissioners have any discussion that they'd like to have on this, or can I get a motion to approve the minutes as they're presented?
I'll
I'll,
make a motion to approve. This
I'll
is for
second.
capacity.
Alrighty, so we have a motion by Commissioner Cassidy and a second by Commissioner Martin. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
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 Motion passes unanimously. So moving on to the next item, which I believe is the discussion there of the commercial parking requirements that we're proposing to amend here. So Dan, I'll kick it over to you for staff's presentation.
Excellent. Thank you, Chair Willett. Appreciate it. And thank you, Commission. Appreciate you being here this evening. So item number 4 are the commercial parking requirements, UDC text amendment. This is a proposal related to really 2 items. One's related to electric vehicle readiness, and the other is related to individual parking plans that has come out of the conversation related to streeteries and the transition from a temporary to a more permanent streeteries program. This is a study session. The goal of this is to educate and inform the Planning Commission and receive their feedback related to this. So with that, we'll get started here, or hopefully. This is just a proposal summary to kind of let you know kind of what you will be talking about. So the proposed UDC amendments is really in 2 parts. The first one is to require EV readiness in new multifamily and commercial development, and to provide incentives for additional infrastructure beyond minimum standards. This was born out of the EV roadmap, as well as really the trend that we're seeing throughout the country as we start to electrify our vehicle fleets. So the proposal that we will be talking about has 3 different parts related to commercial, multifamily, and retail. Each have different use types and ways that people use them, so they're slightly different. So commercial, we have 5% requirement for outlets in our proposal, and 15% to have the kind of conduit, or just have it EV ready. For the proposed multifamily, about 25% would be the requirement, and then retail would be lower to about 10%. The other proposal that we're looking at as well, the other portion, is to expand the use of our individual parking plan by including affordable housing as a permitted type of development, and removing the restaurant and bar exception. All existing individual parking plan requirements, findings, and approval procedures would remain in place and still apply to these uses, and we'll go into further detail related to that. So what we are planning to do is to do the EV readiness stuff, and then we'll kind of pause and have discussion related to that, and then we'll move on to the streeteries, and then talk about the overall package with you. So related to kind of the parking requirements, just to kind of let you know, they're all pretty much held in section 7.4 of our Unified Development Code. It is the motor vehicle and bicycle parking section, or it's in this, it has a large set of minimum number of motor vehicle and bicycle parking spaces for different land uses. So they're segmented out in different land uses and land use types. There are design criteria related to parking and how to design parking lots and where to put bicycle parking and things of that sort related to access. And then there's a section related to reductions and exceptions, and we'll be talking a bit about that as well with both of these items. And that is in 7.4.5. Again, the reason why we have been presenting this as one set of amendments is really because of the overlapping goals related to climate action response, local business support, infill development, walkable neighborhoods. Parking really applies to all of these things in high quality public spaces. The coordination of these will help with a more efficient and holistic approach to parking requirements and help with sustainable development policies. So this is the outline. We'll go electric vehicles, trends, research, proposals, cost estimates, and further considerations, and we'll pause. And then we'll talk about the individual parking plan and some of the items related to that. So just related to stakeholder engagement, we've done stakeholder engagement on both of these. We held 2 stakeholder meetings with the Streeteries group. We've held 3 with our electric vehicle groups. We had separate groups for each of them. And then we held 2 public meetings. So this kind of all kicked off back kind of the end of spring. Kind of began with some research and some initial kind of discussions with our stakeholder meetings, and then eventually having the public meetings, getting the feedback related to that, and then a draft proposal, which is in front of you now. The electric vehicle roadmap was really the impetus for the EV kind of requirements that you'll see in front of you. So there was a vision set out in that was adopted in April 2021. And in that vision is looking at the city as a leader in clean, convenient, and affordable transportation that is accessible to historically underserved communities. So equity is a big part of this, and is powered by locally sourced clean and renewable energy. It views Tucson as a city where residents, businesses, and visitors will choose electric vehicles over conventional fuel vehicles. So setting up that infrastructure to support our change from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. Looking at it, this is kind of the overview of that roadmap. This is the graphic that you'll see when being presented. And it has segmented into immediate, short-term, medium-term, and long-term. Those immediate goals within 6 months are really the item that we're looking at here today. So highlighted there is the portion that says adopt EV readiness ordinances for all new development. Back in June, not back in June, sorry, back in I think it was April, Mayor and Council passed a change to the building code to require EV outlets and charging plugs for 1 and 2 family residences. And at that time, they directed staff and directed us to take a look at commercial and multifamily. So kind of closing that loop on the other portions of this item related to that. So just to kind of do an overview of kind of where we're at with electric vehicles, both nationally and locally. These are some kind of national trends that we're seeing. So just related to market availability, currently there are 50 EV models available today. However, there are expected to be 130 EV models that are available by 2023. So we're seeing rapid growth. This chart on the right shows kind of US vehicle sales by technology type. And the green is hybrid, this yellow and this blue are plug-in hybrid and all electric, and you see them growing. At the same time, what you're seeing here in this red line are conventional vehicles, and you're seeing the drop in conventional vehicles. So what's happening is you're starting to see growth of the electric vehicles as at the same time that you're seeing the kind of drop in conventional vehicles, really showing a need for electric vehicle infrastructure to help and continue that trend. In some studies that have come out recently, they're looking at about 5 years before EVs, plus or minus a couple, are cheaper to buy on average than combustion vehicles without subsidies, which is really important. You're also seeing a lot of used vehicles that have been in the market for a little while, like the Nissan Leaf. You can get an older Nissan Leaf for a relatively cheap price as far as EVs right now. In the next 15 years or so, so recently 6 major automakers, including Ford, GM, and Volvo, have pledged to phase out new gas and diesel vehicles by 2035 and 2040 as they help to build consumer demand. As you know, we have listed here the building lifespan kind of average starts at 30 years. So these buildings will be around a long time. We need to make sure that that infrastructure is there to allow for this to happen as we move forward. It's also a federal priority. So 50% of the federal government is looking at a 50% EV share by 2030. And as you'll see, a lot of kind of newer programs that are all coming out to help support this related to it. As they say, the transformative down payment on a transition to a zero emissions future. This is the way to do so, and in tandem with switching our energy mix to be able to charge those vehicles in the future. So again, national trends kind of looking at electric vehicle shares, still pretty low throughout the states. However, you see most of the higher adoption rates tend to be in our urban areas. So if you look, and even out west, there you see a higher adoption rate out west than you're seeing out east. And Arizona is not much different than that, a little higher rate than you see in Phoenix and you see here, but you know, but we are growing here as well. Local ownership, we went and looked at vehicle registrations, vehicle registration data from ADOT. To kind of map where we're seeing some of the adoption and where it's happening. Obviously, as of now, it appears that it's in more affluent areas, such as the foothills and Oro Valley and that area and those areas up there, which, you know, in a lot of ways, kind of related to what they call range anxiety. This could potentially be a reason for more chargers in Tucson, as people who are commuting from further areas on the periphery, it would allow for them to feel more comfortable driving into town, doing all of their errands, and then coming home and not worrying about running out of energy, essentially. On the bottom left here, this is just looking at those that are registered in zip codes within an hour of Tucson, and the year of the models that have been registered. And you're seeing, again, that growth as you come through here from 2010, where there's almost nothing, up through 2020 and 2021. It's a little shorter in 2021. That's just because this data was pulled, I think, back in October. So I'm likely to see something pretty similar for 2021 at the end of the year. But we are seeing year over year, at least a trend line of growth in electric vehicles in the area. So one thing that's important is really to just kind of think about charging habits and patterns, and then creating regulations related to those charging habits and patterns. As we expand that infrastructure, you know, for this, we need to make sure that it's viable for all drivers, not just people that live in single family homes. One thing that we are seeing is that charging at home is where most of the charging happens. More than 80% of EV chargers charge their cars at home. Basically, they come home, they plug it in, charges overnight, and then they go and they do their, you know, their errands and what they need to do, go to work. Charging at multifamily buildings has become a challenge. About half of Americans do not have access to dedicated off-street parking space for overnight or low-cost EV charging. So this is one of those equity issues that we're seeing as we move forward, and there's more and more people want to adopt EVs. How do we get people in multifamily access to those chargers so they can actually make that transition from internal combustion engines to these electric vehicles? Charging at workplaces, again, you're thinking of places where people spend enough time to have a significant amount of increase in their battery and charging. So you see a lot of charging at workplaces. Employers can help increase the convenience and affordability of driving electric for their employees by providing spaces. And then public charging, and we as a city are also looking at this. This isn't a part of this this amendment, but it's a part of the greater kind of a roadmap that we're working with. So figuring out where to have public charging stations for people to utilize. So there's three different kind of categories that these are generally put into as far as the type of electric vehicle infrastructure and EV readiness. The one farther to the left is really looking forward. This is the EV capable conduit. It's essentially having the wiring and the trenching and the electrical updates ready for when you have that demand. Basically, it minimizes upfront costs. And it kind of reduces the costs that you'll have later on if you would need to retrofit. Generally, retrofits are about 300% more on average if you were to not have those spaces but need to provide them in the future and go back and retrench and put in all of that wiring. The second one is the EV ready outlet. So this is just providing an outlet. So it's really the capable conduit plus the outlet. For that, it is a pretty minimal additional cost. So, you know, a NEMA 1450 outlet could be between $50 and $50 a space. So it's not a huge cost to allow for the potential charging, at least immediately. Again, trenching and conduit and the electrical updates is a really wide cost range. And we'll talk a little bit more about costs, just because depending on the size of the lot, you're going to have a larger demand. The number of EV spaces, a larger demand, and that would kind of warrant what that is. And then the one which you're probably most familiar with is the EV installed stations. These have pretty much everything from the ready, but then it has a ready to charge with controlled access EV space. These are the ones that are networked. A lot of times you'll go and you'll have a credit card, you scan your credit card, plug it in, and then you charge and you charge your vehicle and you get charged a certain amount depending on what you utilize. These are quite expensive, or can be. Charging stations can range from a pretty simple one like the one on the left there from about $500 to $4,000 plus per space. Trenching and conduit obviously is pretty similar, and the electrical updates would be similar, but this is definitely the most expensive. It's also, you know, where we've kind of reduced for the most part, a lot of what we're proposing related to this, just because of the fact that technology is changing quite a bit. This was one that we felt, you know, we may want to hold off on for those type of requirements for certain things like multifamily and or office, where we're trying to really increase access, but reduce costs. Okay, so we did look at other cities to try to get an understanding of kind of what we're seeing as far as requirements elsewhere. We did interviews. When we did so, most of them admitted to doing similar research to what we're doing to develop their regulations. And you know, their motivation was really similar to what we're looking at, wanting to address climate impacts, wanting to be ready for this as we move forward, but also balancing it with the cost and the development cost concerns that are there. So we looked at Albuquerque. Albuquerque developed this regulation a while ago. I have a feeling they're probably going to come back to it and make some revisions to it. It's pretty minimal. All new development, 200 plus spaces require 2% stations, and that's all it is. They have about 2% EV ownership in Albuquerque. Miami-Dade, Florida, they had a phased-in plan. They did 10% EV ready for the outlets, and then it jumped up this last year to 20%. So 20% of their multifamily spaces, they did have a threshold, 9+ spaces. This is something you may want to have us look into related to that, and that was 20% requirement for those EV ready spaces. Salt Lake City, Utah, this was one that Mayor and Council had mentioned at their study session that we had with them to kind of look at as an example for what we may want to do for our proposal. And they are at about 25% for multifamily. They require EV stations on 4% of the total, so 1 per 25 spaces. And then they have 20% requirement for EV ready. They do have a 4% requirement for ADA spaces to be EV capable to allow for that in the future. And then there's on the far other end of the spectrum is a place like San Jose, who has a greater than 20% EV ownership. They are probably some of the most aggressive kind of regulations that we've seen. They require for non-residential 50%, that's a 10% mix of stations with 40% of the EV capable. And then 100% of multifamily and hotels have to have either EV capable, EV ready, or EV stations installed for those. And so from that, we kind of went through and we said, you know, in addition to our EV roadmap, and this was something we posed to our stakeholder group, what are the goals that we're really trying to further here? And really they're ensuring equitable access to the benefits of advocating technology, cost savings, and environmental benefits. Implement baseline requirements at various commercial locations based on visitation frequency, parking time, and diverse. That's why we have 3 different types. Provide significant cost savings by avoiding future retrofits for these developments. And then require the most usable readiness for the least cost and building lifespans beyond 30 years and beyond, which led us to really this proposal. And this is what we're looking at right now. For multifamily, looking at a 25% requirement, kind of similar to what you saw in Salt Lake. We did not require any stations related to this. We required 10% EV outlets and then 15% for the EV capable. And this is because there were cost concerns, but also the technology change related to this. Our thought is that we would have the requirement there, and then it's basically up to that owner on whether or not they want to provide those stations for them, or if they want to figure out another way to essentially to utilize those spaces. It could be maybe they rent out those spaces for a monthly rate, or maybe they eat the cost and they allow for people to plug into them. But this puts it in their hands to figure out how that would potentially work. Commercial, so this is commercial, mainly office, but medical office, things of that sort. 20%. So again, 5% EV ready, but then another 15% for EV capable. So they have that a kind of future ability to expand if need be. Again, we see most of the charging happening at home, but office space and when people are spending extended amounts of time, it's a good place for them to have those chargers available to them. And then the third one is related to retail. This one's another one where there are certain places like a shopping center or a mall where we see people spending a large enough time to where this could potentially be beneficial. Then there's other ones that maybe not. So the requirement here would be for stations because unlike office space or something like that, where you can kind of control the access, it's harder to control access in the retail space. So 5% stations and then 5% outlets kind of looking forward related to that. And again, the shorter dwell times and home, that's the reason why you're seeing less. We do have incentives related to each of these if you go above and beyond that baseline. So for multifamily, for each kind of either I think it's EV outlet or a charger, you can reduce by 1 parking space. Same thing for commercial, and then for retail, these are only for stations, but for every station you provide beyond that, you get 2 less spaces. What that ends up looking like, and this is kind of looking at cost per space, is something like this. So, this first one is the proposal here. We're looking at, cost per space for multifamily would be about, for a larger lot, this is one of the reasons why you may want to discuss a little bit about a potential threshold, a lower threshold on some of these, about $90 to $180 for a larger lot. Those go up as you go down to about 10 to 100 to 250. Looking at incentives, while the per space cost goes up, what's nice about this is that you can offset that cost potentially with not having to build spaces. So, parking spaces really depend on land cost. So we don't have, it could be anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 or less or more. But it allows for you to reduce costs through reducing parking spaces if you were to go above and beyond and potentially offset those costs of having those EV spaces. Similarly, this is what commercial looks like. Same type of thing. They have, the costs are a little lower than the multifamily, obviously, because there's fewer spaces required. But again, as the cost goes up, you can offset it with your reduction. And then this is the retail. Again, same type of thing, except now you're allowing for a 2-space reduction for every station that you provide. So again, per space goes up, but then it's offset potentially by the reduction in parking spaces. I mean, generally, people aren't going to necessarily reduce their parking if they need it. So it doesn't work for everyone. It's based on the market. But in certain circumstances, this could be very beneficial for some applicants related to this. So there are a couple additional kind of further consideration items that we are looking at that aren't necessarily related to the code amendment. One is accessibility. We're looking at a requirement. This is based on guidance from the Department of Energy. 4% of spaces, but no less than one of the EV charging spaces in any given facility must be accessible compliant. Their guidance is that would be in addition to ADA spaces. So they're EV accessible charging spaces. And then guidelines, we're looking at creating guidelines related to signage and markings, things for regulations, wayfinding, where to site some of these spaces. A lot of times you don't want to put them right in front of the building because you end up, people in internal combustion engines end up parking in those spaces right in front. So you want to site them a little further away so it's not being taken up by a car that doesn't need to be charging. And then lot design, ease and safety and implementation and cost savings. So that is the EV proposal in front of you. I want to stop here for a second, just to kind of see if anybody has any questions or comments at this point before I move on to the individual parking plan, kind of parklets and street areas portion.
So are there any questions for staff regarding EV or discussion? Thomas, I see your hand up.
Is there a projection for when Tucsonans are going to be driving EV vehicles? Is it like say in California? I mean, we don't have the income that they have in California. How long is it going to take before Tucsonans are actually going to be really looking for this?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to predict exactly when that's going to happen. We're at a kind of difficult place right now where we're seeing more and more options out there. People are definitely starting to adopt it faster than they were. We're getting a Tesla dealership here in Tucson. However, we don't have the data to really understand when that would occur in Tucson.
I'm having a real hard time with codifying EV vehicles. I'm just not sure why the market can't drive it, why we have to actually create a code around it. So I've got a number of questions like that. I'd really hate to see reduction of parking. It seems like we've already done a good job of reducing parking in our code, but to have incentives to reduce it even more just seems like a overkill. I'm going to hold off on my other thoughts here for right now.
Thank you, Commissioner Taylor-Brown.
Commissioner Ortiz-Pino, you have your hand up.
Yeah, to Commissioner Taylor-Brown's point about codifying EV charging stations, I think it's good to be forward thinking. I think it's hard to anticipate, it's hard to codify something based on current demand, but I do think that the demand will grow. And if we don't have the infrastructure, then demand can't grow. And so I think it's like a chicken and the egg type of situation. And I also share a concern about incentives for parking reductions for EV spots. It just seems like that could be a problem. I don't know maybe enough about the parking requirements, but it just seems like something I would be worried about.
Are there any other commissioners that have questions or discussion? Because I have a few, but I will turn it over to my fellow commissioners first before I get into mine. Well, not seeing any hands or anybody jumping forward. So similar to both Commissioner Saylor Brown and Ortiz Pino, I have a similar question as to where does Tucson fall on this national trend as far as electric charging stations? And I agree, it's very great to be progressive in our thought and forward thinking, but is the stipulation and the requirement fit for the need? And the example that I go to in thinking of is Culinary Dropout, where they exercise the parking reduction to install a bunch of charging stations. However, Culinary Dropout has a parking shortage, in my opinion, because everybody utilizes the TAR, Tucson Association of Realtors, across the street to park. And so you have a bunch of charging stations that are underutilized, and either you have people parking that aren't, electric vehicle users parking in those spaces, or you're not meeting the demand for current parking spaces because of these reductions. So something I think for staff to think about. And then also I'd like staff to think a little bit about putting a threshold on that number of required, so we aren't running into a situation where we have more charging stations than demand for vehicles on that. And then also in terms of the multifamily requirements, there's nothing that kind of separates low-income housing from those. And I think to your next point there of allowing for IPPs to be utilized for affordable housing by not putting something into this electric charging station model that suggests that electric charging vehicles aren't necessary for these types of projects because the demand may not be there. I think we might want to consider those things. So with that, that's all I have to add. If there are any other commissioners that would like to add more,
Yeah, I do.
yours. All
I do.
yours, Thomas.
I had another thought. In your table 7.4.11-1, you left off shopping centers. And you show retail, but you don't have anything for shopping centers. I can see where in shopping centers they're going to create an area for EV parking. They're not going to be, you're probably not going to see individual retailers coming in and putting in their own parking. So I'm just wondering, what's the reason for not having shopping centers in there?
Commissioner Saylor Brown, I actually believe shopping centers should have been included. That is something that should be a part of that proposal. So thanks for pointing that out.
Commissioner Young, your hand is raised.
Yeah, just kind of to join in the conversation here. I definitely understand the idea of not having enough parking and it being a pain, but I guess I feel like the reason that we all drive cars is because of the way we designed our cities in the first place. And going back to the chicken and the egg, unless we start reducing parking and force people essentially to not take their cars, we're just going to have more and more cars. So I think we should be doing that. I know it's maybe not popular with people who drive cars every day, but if we really want to have a world that we can live in where the climate is not, changing rapidly, we really have to reduce the number of cars. And I think reducing parking is a great way to do that. And if, you can put in more charging stations for electric vehicles to reduce your parking need, I think that's a good idea. And, I'm not an expert in this, and I don't know if this is exactly the best way to, go about putting enough infrastructure in for charging electric vehicles, but clearly electric vehicles are the future. Again, for all of the reasons that we know. So, unless we've got a better idea or want to tell staff to come back with something even better, I think this is a great step in getting the infrastructure we need. Because again, if the infrastructure is not there and people start buying electric cars, we're gonna have a problem as well. So I'm supportive of this, generally speaking, based on what I know. And I think that is all that I'd like to say at this point. Thanks.
Any other discussion? Commissioner Lucia?
Yeah, I just had a quick point to add on this. I think for multifamilies, it makes a lot of sense, especially running the conduit and making sure that the infrastructure is laid there so that we're not 10 years from now kind of kicking ourselves for not having the confidence in the vision of the future that has kind of been clearly laid out for us with electric vehicles. I think when it comes to retail, it gets a lot more confusing. Especially, I noticed that the vehicle that was featured in the presentation is a Ford F-150. There's a very large battery bank in that car. It does require a great amount of electric capacity in order to charge it. Generally, you're going to want to run a 80 or 100 amp circuit in order to charge that car, whereas a Tesla Model 3 is going to be a 50 amp circuit. The charging rate on a 50 amp circuit for that F-150 is going to be really minimal if you're going to go in and shop for an hour. So you're talking about like 8 to 10 miles per hour in terms of charging rate on that. So I don't think that retail, especially small scale retail, warrants the requirements, but I heavily agree with multifamilies and commercial properties as well.
Like Scott Clark has his hand up.
Sure, I just wanted to give you a little bit of food for thought, and I certainly appreciate the conversation you're having now. So major American and foreign car manufacturers are phasing out fossil fuel vehicles by 2035. So what that's going to mean for consumers as we continue to move along here in the years is you stand the risk of buying an obsolete vehicle, perhaps from day one, that you'll have very little resale value for, because the market will have shifted to EV. So I don't know how quick that will drive the acceleration of acquisition of electric vehicles, but I know as you know, your standard consumer goes, they're going to look more and more at the fact that fossil vehicles will no longer be produced by 2035. The other thing, and the chicken and the egg, I don't know where to think about this, but some of the concern by consumers is, if I buy this electric vehicle, will I have a place to charge it? So if you're going to create easier access to charging stations, you may in fact accelerate the transition to electric vehicles. That's kind of my theory on that. So I'm just laying that out there for food for thought, because there are now some dates set in stone by the automotive industry when they are going to quit producing fossil vehicles. That's 12 years. So you're really looking at 2 cycles of car payments or mortgages, so to speak. So it's coming rapidly. So just food for thought as you consider this. That's all I've got.
One question I have here on just the topic of incentivizing this type of parking reduction, if you will, or anything. Dan or staff, do you guys have any numbers for what has been currently utilized? Like how many people have exercised a reduction for EV parking spaces currently in the city?
Yeah, so Chair Willett, we don't have a good way of tracking that. We do have, we've seen it a handful of times. Culinary dropout is obviously one of the examples. There's actually a Dairy Queen on the west side that has done that with one charging space, but it's not utilized that often.
Awesome, thank you for that. Does any other commissioners have any other discussion or questions, or are we are comfortable moving on to the next item? Well, not next item, but next part of this item, if you will. All righty, I'm not seeing anything. So Dan, if you want to proceed with the IPP discussion, the floor is yours.
Excellent, thank you, Chair. So Yes, this portion is related to individual parking plan. This was really born out of this conversation related to parklets and streeteries. This was a program that really was born out of COVID and getting people outside and utilizing spaces and allowing for business to continue. Additionally, we have a couple little portions in here related to affordable housing. And it does help with adaptive reuse a bit as well. I do want to note that this proposal is not a by right reduction. It requires the applicant to prove that they can meet parking demand without creating negative impacts on surrounding areas. So this is a site-specific way to deal with these parking reductions that they may need as they move into the future. A little bit of kind of information kind of related to the individual parking plan. So this is located in section 7.4.5A of the Unified Development Code. There are certain project types that can qualify for this. You can either be within a certain portion of, it can either be for like senior housing. It can be for if you're within a certain distance of transit. There's a handful of different criteria. One that it doesn't have currently is that affordable housing is not a current qualifying project type related to that. So that's part of the reason why we're here talking about that portion. Really the goal here is to provide less parking, but having criteria related to that. So they're required by code to conduct a traffic study, show parking occupancy at peak use with that traffic study, demonstrate mitigation strategies. There's additional requirements, and I'll talk a little bit about this a little later. When property owners are within 300 feet of R3 zone or more restrictive, they're required to hold a public meeting and to propose the project and address concerns. And then a lot of times, most of the ones that we see are really the ones that are located within a quarter-mile of transit or public parking facility. And then there is a goal to help people to utilize shared parking agreements related to this. One thing that it currently doesn't allow as well, we talked about affordable housing as a criteria. You can do it as an affordable housing project if you meet the other criteria, but if you don't, you can't. But the one thing that it does is that it restricts restaurants and bars to be able to apply for this unless part of mixed use. Mixed use, however, is a pretty strict criteria. Even with a shared parking agreement, it has to show that it still parks at one space per 100 square feet for restaurants or one space per 50 square feet for bars, which is alcoholic beverage service and food service at peak times. So it's a pretty high bar. One thing to note related to this is that if the development is operated in a manner that violates the conditions of that approved individual parking plan, the use may be suspended or terminated in accordance with section 10.4. So they do have to meet the criteria set out in their individual parking plan and what is approved. So affordable housing, just related to that. The issue that we have in front of us is that multifamily housing requires on-site parking, and it typically utilizes a substantial portion of a lot, and it can be a really significant piece of the project cost. In our code currently, there's no distinction between parking requirements and for affordable housing or market rate multifamily. That is despite evidence that parking demand is lower for affordable housing projects. So one thing that we're looking at doing here, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about next steps that have been laid out in the housing and affordability plan, but allowing for affordable housing to apply for reduced parking requirements. This will help mitigate some of those development costs, making affordable housing more financially viable. Again, this direction actually came out of Mayor and Council in November, I think 23rd. They held a study session related to the housing and affordability plan for Tucson. They directed staff to look at adding this into the individual parking plan. And that is the reason why that it has been added to this project and this proposal in front of you. A pretty simple change, but one that adds in that criteria could potentially help a project that is looking to make it pencil out essentially. Majority of this amendment is really came out of the streeteries and then patio expansions kind of conversation and moving it into a more permanent space. And for today's discussion, and what we're dealing with is what's really on the right-hand side of the screen here. And this is dealing with patio expansions. Streeteries typically are in the right-of-way, they're in the public right-of-way. A lot of times those are dealt with through the Department of Transportation and Mobility, but we've seen a significant amount of patio expansions as well. A lot of times people have extra space on site. There are generally unarranged corridors. So it's a different situation and different criteria, but a lot of times they're on private property. So we were looking at ways and how to transition this from a temporary program to one that's more permanent. In doing so, we did an analysis and a review of really what we've seen, who's utilized this temporary program that has been in place for the last couple of years. So there's been 47 total sites. 26 of those are kind of streetery right-of-way sites. As you can see, it's really a different situation. So most of those are downtown. Those are generally in more walkable places. You'll see a couple near Main Gate, but most of them really are 4th Avenue and then downtown. With one exception being over at Broadway, Broadmoor Village, which, as you likely know, is a little more walkable, at least in that portion that runs alongside of it. And then all the 21 private sites are all really located further out from the downtown core. In doing our analysis, we were looking at barriers on what would happen should this become a permanent program and what would keep them from being able to do this. And we kind of have this set of criteria that goes from likely to unlikely, and we looked at the different sites. You know, at the top, you know, excess parking available, and if they are located within the IID, it should be pretty easy for them to transition, and it shouldn't really be much of an issue. However, as you start going down, you know, lot is already shared. So that's another issue to be able to get that parking reduction with the lot that's shared for those mixed use. And that was kind of back to what I was telling you about with the individual parking plan. And then, you know, 5 of those 21 sites we saw could not meet parking requirements on site. There were 4 additional plans that didn't clearly show the square footage or seats added. So we couldn't really determine exactly how easy it would be for them. But a good 25% likely would not be able to transition from the temporary program to the more permanent program. It is worth noting, I brought this up before, that these are the current parking requirements for bars and restaurants. They are the highest parking requirement that we have in the Unified Development Code. It is 1 space per 50 feet for bars, and it's 1 space per 100 feet, square feet for restaurants. So we have held public meetings and stakeholder meetings, as well as some surveys related to this. We had 2 stakeholder meetings and 2 public meetings. And this is some of the feedback that we've received throughout. So talked a bit about outdoor seating. Some of the things that we heard helped to keep tenants afloat during the pandemic. Customers still prefer the option to sit outside. It hasn't really gone away. Not to say that, you know, pandemic hasn't really gone away either, but existing high number of parking spaces at bars supports drinking and driving. Replacing cars with seats is good for sales tax. It's an easy decision. These were from the survey with a lot of the restaurants that we've heard. Preference to seating, to place seating on parking areas instead of sidewalk areas. So accessibility issues, not blocking sidewalks, rather seated in parking areas. And then one of the comments that came up was just related to whether this should be some more of a seasonal program. And in the survey, basically we asked, you know, when is the best time of year? And it's 64% said really all year. There were some people that said, you know, 29% or so that, you know, maybe a seasonal program might be a good idea. But most of them were in favor of making this a full-time all year program. We have had some concerns related to, 1, reducing parking through the individual parking plan, or just, you know, outdoor seating in general. Some of those concerns that we have heard related to reducing on-site parking requirements will cause customers to park in adjacent neighborhoods. Customers returning to parking in neighborhoods late at night are noisy and inconsiderate. Additional noise concerns when outdoor seating is siting near homes. Enforcement is difficult with limited city resources. Restaurants and bars were negotiated out 10 years ago, and we shouldn't be making any changes to it because it was a negotiation from 10 years ago. And then there were concerns about accessibility for pedestrians and the disabled and ADA requirements. Related to kind of some of those issues, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but and so we have heard some things related to hours of operation. It is a little tricky just because a lot of those are our ability to restrict hours of operation, especially for bars, is really dictated by the liquor board and the state, not necessarily something we can do. But we do have restrictions within our code that actually do address some of these things. Bars aren't allowed in C1 zones. They're only allowed in the more I guess, intense commercial zones, C2 and C3. There's far less of those. They're required to submit a security management plan that addresses a lot of this stuff when they come in and they apply. And additionally, there's additional setbacks when you're close to residential for bars and for restaurants. So 500 feet from outdoor use areas for bars, 200 feet for parking areas, and 500 feet for loudspeakers. They have to be set back all of those already just to be able to locate there, not related to any of the parking issues. Food service also has some restrictions on hours of operation. It's more related to them having to keep their full kitchen open related to that. If they're open after 10 o'clock, they have to have their full kitchen going. But they're also required to be 600 feet from residentially zoned property if they have loudspeakers or music or anything at that time. There were some policy suggestions that came out of this. One was to avoid multiple barriers to the program, consider the resource limits of small businesses, so try to make it as simple as possible. Don't add a whole bunch of additional criteria that make it really difficult. And then there was some talk of an interest in a minimum threshold, so a percentage of a lot that could potentially be reduced related to this. So in front of us, we have kind of these issues. There are a lot of locations that are likely to continue outdoor seating under the existing code requirements, but some won't be able to. Large parking requirements have prevented restaurants and cafes from occupying existing old historic structures, a common constraint on older sites currently, and some concerns expressing regarding negative effects on surrounding neighborhoods. In our proposal, we do, this does allow for more opportunity for business to successfully configure their locations to include outdoor seating. It supports adaptive reuse of existing structures. This has been one of the major barriers outside of downtown for the adaptive reuse of historic structures and changes of use. And then the individual parking plan includes a neighborhood meeting, parking analysis, and the ability to add site-specific conditions to deal with those concerns such as noise. Other existing options for reductions are as of right and require no neighborhood notification. This one does have all of those things. So this is kind of what it looks like related to this. Site-specific reduction proposal allows for applicants to propose fewer parking spaces through an analysis. It would require a notification and a neighborhood meeting if it were within 300 feet of R3 or more restrictive zones. And then ultimately it would be Ptsd director that would approve or deny the parking reductions. Again, site-specific reduction, not a blanket waiver. There are application requirements that go along with this as well. So existing and proposed parking configurations. You can't reduce any ADA spaces. There was concern about accessibility and whether this would create accessibility problems. That doesn't allow for you to reduce any of those requirements. It requires traffic counts and circulation study, identify, alternate modes of transportation, ways that you can do shared parking with other sites. And then notify adjacent neighborhoods and show that noise and light will be minimized, vehicle access will be deterred, neighborhood parking will be prevented. Particularly site configurations can be a part of the approval, which is really important. So for example, if you know, to require outdoor seating could be located adjacent to the street frontage and parking areas instead of adjoining the residential areas. I do want to just mention that, and you likely saw this in the proposal and the code, but there are particular findings that they must meet related to this that address a lot of the concerns that we've heard from the neighbors. So, you know, concern about vehicle access and people parking in the neighborhood, they have to show that vehicle access, drive-through traffic, and habitual parking in adjacent commercial development or residential neighborhoods is deterred. There was concern about light and light from the outdoor spaces, light intrusion into adjoining residential zone cannot be created through this, and they have to prove that they do, and it has to comply with the outdoor lighting code. Outdoor seating areas, there was concern about that. They have to be set back 100 feet or more from residentially zoned properties, unless separated by a building. And then outdoor light loudspeakers must be 600 feet or more from residentially zoned properties. A lot of what's built into this addresses a lot of the concerns that we've heard. Additionally, there's additional criteria that they must meet if they're within 300 feet of R3 or more restrictive. Again, there's the neighborhood meeting everything, but there's more restrictions related to noise and light intrusion. They have to prove that they're deterring vehicle access into any adjacent neighborhoods, and then show that and prove it through the approval. So with this, the goals that we're looking at to achieve through these amendments to the individual parking plan is to provide site-specific flexibility and standards to incentivize and increase the flexibility of affordable housing projects by allowing for them to utilize this. Support more adaptive reuse projects outside of the infill incentive district. Encourage vibrant community atmosphere and appealing activation of public and outdoor space. Encourage efficient use of space and appropriate density that contributes to more walkable spaces. So allowing for people to potentially utilize or reduce their parking when they don't necessarily need it. It's a climate change issue as well, and urban heat island effect issue. If we can reduce impervious surface in places when we don't need it, it's a good thing to do, and it could potentially be a way to do that through this program. And then provide business relief as well as space and health and safety standards in bar and restaurants to go through the ongoing pandemic. Couple other kind of further consideration issues. These may be coming to you at some point in the future. The first, this was kind of came out of the housing affordability strategy for Tucson. To review the parking requirements for affordable housing and other land uses. So this would be one step in this, adding it to the individual parking plan, but going maybe further and actually creating reductions related to affordable housing in our zoning code. And then another one that may be coming to you at some point is the review of the liquor mitigation plan requirement for bars and restaurants. So the Arizona Department of Liquor License and Control will no longer grant extensions for liquor license applications. This has messed up the timing between state and city processes. So what ends up happening is that we used to actually grant extensions and be able to grant extensions. We no longer can, but the actual regulations and requirements of the liquor mitigation plan come after when mayor and council would normally approve for that. So it's created an issue for businesses who are trying to get a liquor license. So there is the possibility that mayor and council could direct us to review the liquor mitigation plan for its effectiveness and considering potential, removing that requirement or changing the requirement to kind of fix that issue. So with that, I know that was a lot. And some of these are pretty complex issues. This is the proposal summary in front of you. The requirement for EV readiness, which we discussed, related to that for 20% commercial, 25% multifamily, and 10% retail. And then expanding the use of the individual parking plan by including affordable housing as a permitted type, and then removing the restaurant and bar exception. Keeping all other individual parking plan requirements, findings, and approval procedures in place. And with that, yeah, our recommendation to you is to set this for a public hearing for the Planning Commission on March 2nd, 2022. And we are happy to take any questions related to the individual parking plan proposal as well and discuss that.
Thank you, Dan, for your thorough presentation there. I certainly appreciate it. Chair Martin, your hand is up.
No longer Chair Martin, but
Excuse me, Vice Chair Martin now.
Daniel, maybe I wasn't listening well, but how is affordable housing defined?
I'd have to look and see what we've listed it as. I think we would have to, it would be as defined by Housing and Community Development, or we would do probably a percentage AMI or something of that sort.
Okay, thank you.
Do any other commissioners have any questions or discussion?
Yeah, I do.
Commissioner Young?
So just a clarification, the use of the IPP is already happening, and we're just talking about expanding this to include affordable housing and removing the restaurant and bar exception. And so it sounds like in order to do this, you have to spend a lot of money to meet all of the different requirements. I mean, meetings and, you know, all of traffic mitigation and all of that stuff. Is that correct? Do I understand that correctly?
Commissioner Young, yeah, it would require an additional process for people to go through to get that reduction. It's kind of a compromise between it's just a full out reduction and kind of some of the concerns related to some of what those impacts could potentially be.
How much does it cost to do that? I mean, it just seems prohibitively expensive potentially to go through this process, not knowing whether or not you're going to get it. I mean, if you have a meeting with, you know, whoever you need to have a public meeting with, and there's a lot of opposition, then is it voted down that it won't be able to move forward, and that's that? Or how does that work? Again, cost and like how does it work if for it not to be approved, I guess, basically.
Yeah, Commissioner Young said, yeah, so the application cost is around $800 or so. And then it's another $220 for the notification portion of that. So it's significant. It can be very expensive or pretty expensive.
Well, and also, I mean, I guess I was just thinking about, like, you know, I don't remember all of the things off the top of my head, but like, you know, you have to prove the something about traffic mitigation, or I mean, if I'm a restaurant owner or an affordable housing developer, I probably am going to need to hire somebody to do that and a bunch of the other things. So, you know, $1,000, you know, to the city or to do the process is one thing, but paying for all of these other experts is quite another, I would imagine.
No, Commissioner Young, that is correct. And I will say, just kind of related to how the individual parking plan works, is that we do take that feedback from the neighbors, from the neighborhood meeting, and then they either have to address those concerns that were a part of that, or site-specific conditions get added to help mitigate those concerns before any approval will be made.
Okay. Thank you.
Dan, I have a question along Commissioner Young's thoughts there. Do these requirements only apply for restaurant and bar uses and affordable housing, or is this added in addition to? So you'd have to go through. I guess my question is it any different than what the standard IPP process already permits or allows for, if you will, or is it just, you know, simply adding the allowance to be able to exercise this use for bars, restaurants, and more affordable housing?
Yeah, Chair Willett, yes, so it is basically just adding the allowance for bars and restaurants and affordable housing. All individual parking plans currently have to meet all of these criteria and go through this process.
Okay, that's what I thought. To add some thoughts, I think this is a really great process, and removing the exemption there for restaurants and bar uses is great. I know in my line of work, we run into parking situations quite often, and oftentimes for bars and restaurants where they make perfect sense, where they're appropriate located. And so having the ability to exercise the IPP for bars and restaurants where it makes sense with additional mitigation requirements, I think it is a great progressive notion. Commissioner Ortiz-Pino, I see your hand up.
Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, but in your presentation, you mentioned that there's evidence and literature saying that affordable housing has more parking than it needs. And is there a reason why we are addressing that issue with an IPP as opposed to maybe reducing their parking requirements elsewhere in the code, just creating their own affordable housing restriction instead of making them go through an entire process like Commissioner Young was saying?
Yeah, so Commissioner Ortiz-Pino, yeah, so the part of the reason why we have the portion related to the individual parking plan in front of you is because that is what was directed to us at the meeting by Mayor and Council. They did approve the remaining portion of the other portion of the housing affordability strategy plan for Tucson, which does include, actual reductions overall, just by right reductions. That is something that, I think we would likely be back in front of you in the future, and you can always recommend to Mayor and Council to do that as well.
So if I understood you correctly, there's already direction to have by right reductions in affordable housing parking. Is that moving forward?
Yeah, I believe there is direction in that plan to do so. Yes.
And then this.
There's direction in a policy document. However, it has not been initiated by Mayor and Council and wasn't really the subject of the discussion. So I think it's a little bit outside the scope of this current amendment that's before the commission, but is absolutely a related item that we see as a priority to facilitate more affordable housing development, and is definitely on our agenda.
Would if in the potential future where that moved forward and passed, and this proposal also passed, would the IPP be able to further reduce those by right reductions already?
So yeah, Commissioner Ortiz-Pino, yeah, so there's no limit on the amount that you can reduce. You just have to prove that you don't need that you have either mitigated some of the either mitigated the impacts or meet the findings and that type of thing. So yes, you could potentially reduce it even further than that, if that were the case.
Thank you.
So Dan, if I may, and to just better understand, basically, if you were an affordable housing user, any user looking to establish or exercise the IPP, basically what you do as part of the process is you demonstrate some sort of analysis through a traffic study, et cetera, to verify and justify the number of parking spaces that the use dictates or demands, if you will. And then you have a neighborhood meeting, assuming all of that goes well in your favor. That's something that then Scott would approve or deny, or the director at the time would approve or deny. Is that correct?
Yes, Commissioner Chair. Well, yes, that's correct. Okay,
perfect. And are there, have you guys done any research about other jurisdictions here locally that are utilizing similar analysis, if you will, or their code allows for that type of exercise to allow more or less the market to dictate parking requirements?
Yeah, so Chair, well, that's actually quite interesting. We're seeing parking reductions kind of being passed in a lot of areas around here. Just a couple examples. Marana recently has gone and gotten rid of their parking requirements, and then you just have to prove what you need when you come in with your development. We've also seen places like Chandler recently has gone through and done an across the board 40% reduction in their parking requirements as well. And this is all in anticipation of reduced need, but also kind of what they see as far as use patterns moving forward.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Martin, did you have any other questions, or is your hand still just raised from the last one you had? I take that as it's just still raised from the last one there. Do any other commissioners have any items to discuss or questions? And if not, can I get a motion?
I'll make a motion to set the public hearing for March 2nd, 2022.
I'll second.
All right. Great, so I have a motion by Commissioner Cassidy and a second by Commissioner Young. Do we need to do a roll call, Dan, or is it just all in favor, say aye?
You can do all in favor, say aye. If someone says nay, we'll do a roll call.
Okay, so all of those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposing? Hearing none, so it looks like the commission recommends that staff take this for a public hearing on March 2nd, 2022. So moving on to the next item on the agenda, we have PDSD staff announcements. Would staff please provide us with any announcements?
Chair Walcott, I am announcement free tonight.
Well, all righty then. Moving on to the next one, any future agenda items there, Dan?
Yes, so we have the commercial parking UDC code amendment public hearing coming up on March 3rd. And then a couple other items that we're looking in the future is informational presentation on the housing affordability strategy for Tucson. We'd like to come back and do that with you. And then we'd like to come and do a Plan Tucson progress report update and update to the general plan in the near future.
Very good, thank you. The next item on the agenda is call to the audience. So this is a time for anybody joining us to speak to the commission. So I see one hand raised. Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you. My name is Robert Bulacek. I'm a member of the Tucson Commission on Climate, Energy, and Sustainability. And I've been an exclusively EV driver for the past 7 years. So I've been taking notes as we've gone through this discussion, and I'll be talking just about the EV part. My first comment is I'd like to push back a little bit on the comment about that technology change is an actual issue relevant to this. Things have settled very much on the J1772 standard and the NEMA 1450 outlet. The history of that is that for a long time, the most accessible electricity in rural areas was RV parks, and that's what they use. So most portable charging cables and even stationary vehicle chargers use the NEMA 1450 outlet as their plug. And so that's just well established and not going to change anytime soon. And frankly, 40 amp charging is quite adequate for most purposes. And one thing that wasn't mentioned was that there's a piece of the electrical code that says if a load is going to be continuous for 3 hours or more, the circuit has to be derated by 20%. So when I talk about a 50 amp breaker that can charge at 40 amps, and a 40 amp breaker can charge at 32 amps. So it's important to talk about whether you're talking about the rate of charging or the size of the breaker. The size of the breaker always needs to be 20% larger. So where there is technology change is in the fast charging area, where over time vehicles and fast chargers are getting faster. But really, none of that is relevant to talking about residential, multifamily, commercial, workplace charging. In that situation, well, let me explain it this way. An important thing to understand about the difference between gas cars and electric cars is what you're used to in a gas car is driving it till it's almost empty and then filling it up. The secret to making an electric car convenient is to treat it like your smartphone. My rule of thumb is if I'm going to be around electricity for an hour or more, I plug in while I'm there and I replenish the miles that I drove. So really, it's more of just a process of replenishing miles where your car is parked while you're doing something else. And that's a little bit hard to wrap your head around if you haven't experienced it. But it really is a behavior change in how things are done. And the second aspect of that is people don't realize how much more efficient electric cars are than gas cars. So if you're used to spending $40 or $50 to fill up your tank of gas, then that's $4 or $5 of electricity that you might use to do similar things with an electric car. So just the energy cost is tremendously lower. An important technical detail is that since we are used to using RV parks where the outlets are on 50 amp breakers, most people have portable charging cables that expect to be able to draw 40 amps. So something the city did with their residential code, which I really think was a mistake, was they derated the breakers so that with the NEMA 1450 outlet, you can use only a 40 amp breaker. I believe that was a mistake that will lead to convenience problems, namely nuisance tripping, and perhaps even safety issues where the wiring may overheat because it's not following the 20% rule. So I think it is important that the standard should be a 1450 outlet on a 50 amp breaker. That's what the 50 in the name means. Another kind of difference that people who don't drive EVs may not understand is that the power that you need at the location depends on how long you're going to be there. If it's a location that you're going to be at for less than an hour, say, then the appropriate charger is really a fast charger. So I would argue that grocery stores and fast food restaurants, you know, what they really need is a fast charger to get a reasonable amount of charge and make it worth the trouble. And I'll give you an example of what I consider a sort of poor implementation is Jersey Mike's has set 4 or 5, I forget, relatively slow level 2 chargers. They're only 32 amp chargers. And that's a fast food restaurant. When I go there for lunch, I'm only there for half an hour or so. Well, a half an hour at 32 amps is not really worth the trouble. You're only picking up, 15, 20 miles of range in that time, if that. And so that would have been an example of a good location for a fast charger if you're only there half an hour. For locations that you're at an hour or two, like movie theaters or restaurants, things like that, a level 2 charger at 40 amps is just fine. You're going to pick up, 30, 40, 50 miles of range while you're there having a leisurely dinner. And then something that also people don't really realize, if it's a location you're at for 8 to 12 hours, say, like all night at home or all day at work, often a simple 120 volt outlet is sufficient to add 50 miles of range overnight. And so when we're talking multifamily or workplace charging, yes, you should have some faster chargers available if somebody needs to charge more quickly. But often just a 120 volt outlet is sufficient for 80–90% of the use. And, as a driver, if let's say I had a $75,000 or $100,000 budget, I would much rather have 200 NEMA 1450s that might cost $500 a piece to install versus one fast charger at $75,000 or more, depending on what the power drop is. So, if you're not a driver, there's some things that are not obvious. But of course, the most obvious things is the reason that we need this is twofold. One is it's just way less expensive to do this in new construction than as a retrofit. So, one person asked, well, why are we doing this? The answer is very simple. It's to save money. If we can get this stuff installed in new construction, we can save a huge amount of money. And another person asked the question, well, how quickly is this stuff or EVs being implemented? Well, if you're a student of Clayton Christensen, a Harvard professor who studies technology adoption, you know that the kind of rule of thumb is that once the technology passes about the 20% adoption rate, it really takes off and very quickly goes to 80%. So United States is still in the early adopter stage, but that's where many countries in Europe were 3 years ago. They were in the 3 to 5% range. And today, many of them are above 20%. In fact, Norway's at 90% of new car sales have a plug. So they crossed that technological chasm in only 3 years. And the numbers are just, exploding. And so the manufacturer estimate that 50% of new car sales in the United States will be electrified by 2030 is a quite reasonable one. So when we think about how long these parking lots are going to go between paving or how long this infrastructure is going to stand, the adoption rate right now is small, but increasing rapidly, and easily within the lifetime of the infrastructure that's being built today, we're going to have very high percentages of penetration. So let's think ahead and save that money. And so another reason to be thinking about this is that the market failures of multifamily and workplace charging have that split incentive problem. You have a situation where one person pays for the infrastructure and another person gets the benefit, and that's a very tough market problem. The simple unnetworked chargers, or the NEMA 1450 is $50 at Home Depot, whereas the fancy network ones are $3,000 or $4,000, and you can do a whole lot of free charging for that price difference. And so, just as a practical matter, and also, especially if you're looking at equity issues, the chargers need to be convenient and they need to be inexpensive. And fast chargers and network chargers tend to be rather expensive. I rent out my electric vehicles on Turo, and so I'm often working with people who are new drivers. And I had one yesterday who plugged in at a local hotel, not realizing there was a fee for an idle fee, a fee for not charging. And they paid $30 for 10 kilowatt hours of electricity, or $3 a kilowatt hour, whereas at home you pay 12 cents. And so if you're a renter, you need to be able to plug it in when you get home, tell the car to start charging after peak period, and be able to unplug it the next morning. And that's just not very practical with network chargers that charge by the minute or have an idle fee, where instead of instead of being billed $4 or $5 for the electricity, you pay $30 because the car sat there not charging all night. So there's a lot of, small details that are gotchas in this, but overall, the reason that we do this is that not only will we save a lot of money in the construction of this equipment, but the people who adopt the electric vehicles will save an enormous amount of money in energy costs, in convenience and maintenance cost of the vehicles, and our city will save in its health and climate costs because, Pima County has had numerous ozone alerts, and one of the ways that we can most directly affect those health impacts is by electrifying transportation. And so thank you very much, and I hope this has been helpful.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Belichick. We appreciate your time this evening. Are there any other speakers who would like to address the commission this evening? And I just do want to iterate, I forgot to mention this, sorry, my first time on the job here. All speakers are limited to 3 minutes. So moving forward here, if anybody who would like to address the commission, 3 minutes is your time limit. So if there's anybody else in the audience wishing to speak, the floor is yours. Well, Dan, do you have anybody on your end that you're aware of who might wish to? Okay, well then moving on to the next item, which I believe is adjournment. Do I have a motion from anyone in the commission to adjourn?
I will motion to adjourn.
Thank
second
you.
that.
Thank you. So I have a motion to adjourn from Commissioner Ortiz-Pino and a second from Commissioner Saylor Brown. So with that, thank you everybody for your patience this evening, and we will see you all on March 2nd, correct, Dan?
Yes, it'll be March 2nd. See you then. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.